Okay, so this is the video for Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is called Measuring Instruments. So the learning objectives are to understand the three key criteria for a measuring instrument: reliability, validity, and precision, and also to understand scales of measurement. So the first of the three key criteria is reliability. So reliability has multiple meanings in both statistics and daily life. But in this context, it means consistency. So do we get the same result if we measure repeatedly? So the various types of reliability in the context of different ways of doing repeated measurements. So the simplest one is what we call test-retest. So that means we're measuring a second time using the same sample and the same instrument. Okay? So obviously we would expect, as long as the sample has not changed, and the either in terms of the selection of the sample or in the thing we're measuring on the sample, we would expect to get the same result. The second form we're going to talk about is split half. So this would be mainly for a survey instrument where we might have multiple questions which are all supposed to be measuring the same thing. So in this situation, if we compare half of our questions to the other half of the questions, we would expect to get similar answers if the questions are all measuring the same thing. So that's called split half. The third form we will talk about is called inter-rater. So this is the same sample, but different interviewers or different instruments. So for example, well, we'll talk about some examples in a minute. So there are other more mathematical definitions. Essentially, we're looking for consistency in different ways, either across time, across instruments, across interviewers, or across items of a questionnaire. Now notice that if we're dealing with a mathematical formula, of course, should be perfectly reliable, as it should always give the same answer. So we're essentially talking about only when we're measuring things which have some implicit variability in the measurement process, then we have to worry about reliability. So what about validity? So validity is our second key criterion. So validity is about whether our measurement is really measuring the concept that we're trying to measure, as opposed to something else. So is it meaningful as a measurement tool for this concept? So the starting point for validity is called face validity, which asks the question, does it even look like it's measuring the right thing? So for example, if I want to measure somebody's weight, and I say I'm going to assess your weight by asking how much money you have in your pocket. Now it's true, if you have lots of coins in your pocket, then if you stand on the scales, you will appear to be heavier, but that's not your weight. That's just the weight of the money in your pocket. So clearly in that case, the face validity is low, meaning it doesn't even seem to be measuring the right thing. The second form of validity is what we call criterion or predictive validity. So the question is, does our measurement predict the outcomes that we believe relate to the concept we're trying to measure? So for example, if we are quite sure that people who are heavy should have more diabetes, does our measurement of weight predict diabetes? Okay, that would be a form of predictive validity. The next form is construct validity. So does it relate to other variables in the way our theory predicts? So for example, if we're measuring marital satisfaction and our theory says that marital satisfaction should be associated with marital fidelity, is that true? If not, then that calls into question either our theory or our measurement tool. The last one we're going to consider is content validity. So this is rather different. This is not quantitative in quite the same sense. This is more asking the question, does it cover the range of meanings contained in that concept? So for example, if we're trying to measure prejudice, then it should encompass prejudice on grounds of race, minority, gender, language, birthplace, and so on. So if it doesn't cover all of those, then it doesn't have high content validity. Now you need to be a little bit careful because validity is also used in the context of evaluating a research design. So this is different to validity in terms of a measurement tool. So when we talk about a research design, internal validity is about our earlier discussion about association versus causation. In other words, are our conclusions about the independent variables causing the dependent variables correct? So this might be called into question if we had association but we were not sure whether it was actually causation. And then external validity is, can the findings be generalized outside the conditions of the study? Okay, so that has again to do with our research design. Now the third criteria that I talked about was precision. So precision, again, this has an everyday meaning, but here this is essentially what level of accuracy we have made the measurement to. So for example, age. If we're measuring age, a relatively crude form would be to the nearest decade. We could measure it to the nearest year or even month or even day. So if, for example, we know someone's exact birth date, then clearly we know their age down to the day. Now, there is little point in having precision that's not needed, but of course if the precision is too low, we cannot fix it later. So it can depend on the situation. So if we're talking about newborn babies, clearly we would often want to know the age in days, if not weeks. We certainly would not want to know just in months. That's too broad. But if we're talking about the elderly, then clearly age in months normally would be far too precise. The nearest year would normally be fine. And usually there isn't too much impact on cost unless it's sensitive data which people are reluctant to reveal. So for example, if we're asking people their age or income, they may not be very happy to tell you their exact age or their exact income. But we do have to be careful because sometimes very precise measurements may not be practicable. So for example, if we want to know people's income, that may be actually quite hard to calculate for people who do not have a fixed monthly income. So a typical example would be a taxi driver, right? So most taxi drivers in Hong Kong do not have a salary. They pay to rent their taxi in most cases, although a few may own their taxis, but most of them rent the taxis on a daily basis, and then they have to pay for fuel, and then they get to keep the net income from what they get from the taxi fares and the tips. So that obviously will vary from day to day. So unless they keep very precise records, it may be quite hard for them even to tell you their exact income. Now, having considered these three key criteria, we need to realize that there may be some trade-offs, particularly between reliability and validity. Because obviously, ideally, we would like a very reliable measurement and a very valid measurement. But highly reliable measures are likely to be very factual and may not have a very high validity. Conversely, measures that have very high validity may be very personalized and may have relatively low reliability. So personalized does not necessarily mean it is not objective. It can just mean that the measuring instrument doesn't work quite the same way for all the sample elements. So objective assessment will almost always be more reliable, but it may not be more valid than a relatively subjective assessment. So for example, consider we're trying to measure the quality of a culture in a social science example, or the quality of a user interface, right? So if in computer science we say how good is the user interface, it may be very hard to end up with a valid assessment which is very objective. It may be that it does actually need to be subjective. Now, of course, we don't have to only use a single measurement tool. We can use multiple measuring tools simultaneously to account for both different dimensions, and also ensure we have both some highly reliable measurements and some highly valid measurements. Okay, so this is all really rather abstract. So we're going to talk about how to make operational choices. In other words, how to measure something. And we're going to talk through some examples of how we might make those choices. So we're going to start with a very simple example. So this one is one where, because we're not in the lecture room, you're going to have to imagine this a little bit. So my research question was, is the lecture room at a comfortable temperature? Okay, so first of all, what is the concept we're trying to measure? Right, so we're not looking for different research methodologies, we're looking for different ways to measure the concept which underpins our research question. So what comfort of the temperature in the lecture room is the concept we're trying to measure. So how might we measure that? So let's consider possible operationalizations. So some of the lecture theatres in Hong Kong U, but not all of them, have a thermometer in the room. And they used to still have quite a few until recently, which were still metal strip based. In other words, they had a spiral metal strip, and as the temperature goes up, the metal strip expands, and hence it gives a reading based on the expansion of that metal strip. Nowadays, they're nearly all digital, so we actually don't know how they're working. We don't really know what the mechanism is. We just see the temperature in tenths of a degree centigrade, if I remember correctly. Okay, so let's just think about that. So how good is a thermometer in terms of reliability and validity? So in general, the reliability would be quite high. Actually, interestingly, some of the bigger lecture theatres have multiple thermometers which don't give the same reading. But there can be a good reason for that, because the thermometers are measuring the temperature at different places in the room. So the temperature is not usually constant across the whole room. So we expect the reliability to be quite high, because usually these have been checked for reliability before they're put into the room. But what about the validity? So we have to be a little bit careful here. If we're just saying, are they measuring the temperature accurately, I would trust that the validity should be quite good. They should have been calibrated quite well before installation. Although over a long period of time, the calibration may deteriorate if they're not recalibrated. But that's not quite what we're interested in here. The concept is not the temperature in the lecture room, it's the comfort of the temperature in the lecture room. So it's actually measuring temperature, not comfort. So it's not clear whether measuring the temperature is actually accurately measuring the comfort of the temperature in the lecture room, right? So one person might be wearing a t-shirt, another person might be wearing a coat, and hence those two people might feel very differently about what's a comfortable temperature. And also, if it's a hot day outside, people will generally come in with less clothes. If it's a cold day outside, people will generally come in with more clothes. So even as a group, we may feel either that the temperature is too cold or hot, depending on the temperature outside, not just the temperature inside. So, of course, another way would be to simply ask everyone in the room how they feel about the temperature. We could have a 5-point scale, say very cold, cold, about right, warm, and very warm. So this is clearly a subjective scale which would take into account the comfort people actually feel, regardless of why they feel that way. Right? So clearly this time around the validity should be high, because we're directly measuring the concept. But the reliability may be much more questionable. So on another day, if I come in wearing more or less clothes, I may rate the room comfort quite differently, even if it's the same temperature. So we've got a problem of reliability across the individuals in the room, and also across time if we come back and do a measurement on another day. So we can see that both of these measurement tools have their own strengths and weaknesses. Okay, so that's a relatively simple one to start with. So let's consider one a little bit more challenging. So let's say the research question was, is Hong Kong or Singapore a better place to live? Okay, so what's the concept? The concept here is quality of life in a specified place. Okay, So let's think about different operationalizations. And so some of these maybe seem a little bit odd at first, but I'm going to try and explain to you why they might be possibly operationalizations for us to consider. So the first one we might consider is migration rates. So the idea here is if a place is good to live, then people generally want to go and live there. If a place is bad to live, people generally want to leave. So in this last year or so in Hong Kong, the newspapers have had constant articles about how everybody wants to leave because of the protests. Actually, not so much these last few months, not just, I think, because the protests have died down, but because people realize it's very hard to leave with the current limitations on air travel, and also many other places are worse than Hong Kong in terms of the virus. But of course, maybe if you're somewhere else, maybe if you're still studying in the mainland, you feel safer there than coming back to Hong Kong, because maybe you're somewhere where the virus is less serious. So of course, this can change over time, right? Migration rates, and also the reasoning that people have about whether somewhere is a good place to live or a bad place to live. So in fact, actually, in order to compare the virus in Hong Kong and Singapore, for example, you have to be a little bit careful. Comparing absolute deaths, for example, is not really reasonable because Hong Kong has more people than Singapore. So you would perhaps at least want to scale the death rate relative to the population size, or maybe even the number of infections relative to the population size. Okay, so let's think about migration rates in terms of reliability and validity. So in terms of reliability, historically, both Hong Kong and Singapore used to have quite a lot of illegal immigrants because we're both surrounded by sea. So it's relatively easy for people to land in Hong Kong and Singapore by sea without going through the official channels for coming in. In fact, you've probably seen this recent newspaper story about people trying to leave Hong Kong without getting proper authorization and getting stopped by the mainland authorities when they were trying to go to Taiwan. So, traditionally it was relatively easy for people to come in and out of Hong Kong. So in fact, until 1980, Hong Kong had what was called the touch-based policy. So if people managed to get to the urban areas of Hong Kong from the mainland without getting caught, they were allowed to stay. If they got caught out in the new territories, they were sent back to the mainland. So that only changed in 1980. It's only in the last 40 years that we've had a much more controlled system. And then also illegal immigrants. So when in Hong Kong these days, when people talk about people who are in Hong Kong illegally, the vast majority of them came into Hong Kong legally, but they did not leave when their visa ran out. Right, so the number of people who come in illegally these days is quite small. There are still some, but it's relatively small. So we know the population flows actually quite accurately. So the population flows for somewhere like Hong Kong are enormous. If you look at the number of people who cross the border to the mainland, except of course during the virus. So the virus has changed all of this, but normally the daily population flows by land are enormous. And when things are back to normal, the number of people coming in and out the airport are also enormous. So anyway, we know the population flows quite accurately. There is some tricky issue because knowing the population flow is not quite the same as migration, right? So if somebody goes from Hong Kong and flies to America, they could be flying there for holiday, which should normally be a relatively short period of time, maybe a week or less. They could be going there to study, which might be, say, 3 months, or they could be going there to migrate, right? So when they leave, the government has no way of knowing what their reason is for leaving, right? So we don't know in that way directly. So all we can do is check back later and see if they came back. Anyway, so Hong Kong and Singapore, we know population flows quite accurately. That's not true in other places. So Europe, this has been a big deal because there's very weak national border controls within the European Union. So they frankly don't know the local populations very precisely because of a large number of people crossing the border without any passing through any immigration controls. So what about validity? So validity, as I've said, in general we would expect that if it's a good place to live, people would come in. If it's a bad place, they would leave. But we need to recognize that that's actually not the whole story. So in other words, even if I wanted to go and live in Australia, given my age, it would be relatively hard for me to get approval from the Australian government to go and live there permanently. Right? So unless I was going there for family reunion and I could show that I would support myself essentially for the rest of my life, it's probably going to be very hard for me to get a visa. For most of you, it's probably not going to be too hard. You're young, you're well qualified, or you will be when you finish your degree. So generally for most of you, it's not hard to go and get a visa to go and live in Australia. But that means that even if I want to go and live somewhere, I may not be allowed in. So unless you have skills, money, or family reunion, it may be quite hard to migrate to the place you want to. Okay, let's think about another way to assess. So what about opinion polls? So in Hong Kong, people are sometimes a bit obsessed with opinion polls. They think that they understand everything by doing opinion polls. So even though I do lots of opinion polls, I don't think they're that good at all as some people think they are. So they can be useful in terms of understanding, finding out what people know about or what their views are, but you need to recognize that those views can be very influenced by media coverage or by recent events. So think about it. If we did a poll in Hong Kong and Singapore, how would that work? Well, I've actually said Hong Kong, Singapore, and the third place, and we'll see why in a moment. Because if we think about reliability, clearly this depends quite heavily on media reports. So because of the media reports recently about protests and Hong Kong people being anti-mainland, and many mainland people would think Hong Kong is not a very good place to live. On the other hand, there was a time a few years back where Singapore sent back a whole number of people, I think about 100 people, back to the mainland. They were thrown out of Singapore because they went on strike. And the Singapore government wasn't happy and basically sent them back to the mainland. So that didn't get nearly as much media coverage, either in Singapore or in the mainland. But you can imagine if something like an event like that got significant media coverage, then people might change their attitude about whether Singapore was a good place to live. So validity. So what is the validity? So if you ask me in Hong Kong to think about Hong Kong and Singapore as a place to live, okay, so if I've lived in Hong Kong for a reasonable time, then that should be reasonable, right? I should know what I'm talking about. But how would I know what it's like to live in Singapore unless I've also lived there? Right? So unless you restricted yourself to people who had lived in both places, one can argue, what is the validity? What is this opinion based on? Is it based on personal experience as a resident or as a tourist? Is it based on what my family or friends have told me? Or is it based on media reports, all of which may be biased? Right? So that's quite problematic. So I've suggested maybe a third place. But again, that third place will probably be even more problematic in the sense that people will have even less knowledge about what it's like to live in Hong Kong and Singapore. Okay, so let's think of another example. So suicide rates. So you may think suicide rates is a very extreme way to assess, what's it like to live in a particular place, the quality of life. So, well, okay, let's first of all think about suicide rates. So reliability, so clearly death rates are very reliable, right? We clearly know when someone is dead. The only tricky issue would be whether that death is indeed due to suicide, because not all people who commit suicide leave a suicide note. And of course, even if they do leave a suicide note, you might question whether it was really a murder, not a suicide. Hopefully not too many of those, right? So reliability, though, should be pretty good. We should know pretty accurately how many people are dying due to suicide. What about validity? Okay, so you might say, what on earth has suicide got to do with the quality of life? This is about people, how many people are mentally ill. Okay, but you could actually see that as, yes, it's still a measure of the quality of life because it has maybe to do with how well we treat people who are mentally ill. If they're well looked after, then they perhaps wouldn't commit suicide because we treat them using drugs or whatever other way we think is appropriate to try and help people deal with their mental illness. But of course, you could also see suicide as a way to escape a terrible life. Right? So both of these imply that there is a very poor quality of life for some people. In fact, I spent 3 years working for the government, and while I was working for the government, I was a justice of the peace. So a justice of the peace in Hong Kong means that, for example, I think it's every 3 months, you visit either a prison or a hospital to try and see whether the conditions are okay, and anybody who's not happy can come and explain to you why they're unhappy so that you can at least try to help out with their situation. So I have to say, of all the prisons and all the hospitals I visited across those 3 years, most of them to me were really very good. The prisons were in excellent shape. The people were looked after very well. Most of the hospitals were also very good. The one exception to me was visiting the hospital for the mentally ill, which was, I think, my scariest situation I've ever been in my whole time in Hong Kong. Now, I know that that hospital has improved since the time that I visited it, but at that time I really thought it was very disturbing. In fact, when I visited the prison that had people who were mentally ill, I thought the conditions were much better, and frankly, in the prison than they were in the hospital, which is really quite a disappointing thing to discover. But it did make me realize that life for the mentally ill in Hong Kong is really quite poor, right? So we have a very good hospital system if you ever need hospital care, but I have to say that the support for the mentally ill isn't nearly as good. Okay, so what else can we do? So I've got 2 more here. So air pollution levels. So what about air pollution levels? What about the reliability? Well, clearly that should be quite good, right? We should be able to measure the air pollution levels quite accurately. In fact, the main weakness is that we only have measuring stations in a relatively small number of places. But in this day of big data, we can actually predict the air quality in most places in Hong Kong quite accurately. So the reliability of the air pollution data is quite high. Validity. Okay, so if you are somebody who is asthmatic, then generally that means that poor air quality really affects your quality of life. It may mean you have difficulty breathing. It can be extremely uncomfortable when the air quality is poor here if you're an asthmatic. But of course, this is only one element of quality of life. If you're young and healthy, maybe you don't see this as too much of a problem, right? So clearly for some people, air pollution levels are a very serious issue, whereas for others, they're not. So lastly, the typical things which governments do is they ask experts to rate different places on a set of living characteristics. So you'll see all of these things reported in the paper saying, Hong Kong has the freest economy. I think Shenzhen has the most innovative city economy in Greater China, and so on. All of these are based on quote-unquote experts who are rating a place on a series of living characteristics or other characteristics. So the reliability should be quite high if these indeed are experts on those characteristics. And indeed, we can check, do the different experts rate these cities in a similar way on the different characteristics? If they don't, then that clearly calls into question the information they have, or whether they are all truly experts. What about the validity? Well, the issue here is who gets to choose which characteristics. So most of these indexes which say, city so-and-so is so wonderful or so terrible, actually are a bit problematic in the sense that it's just one person who got to decide the importance of all the characteristics. But whether those are relevant to you, so if you're trying to decide where to live, should I live in Hong Kong or Singapore, then relying on some expert to decide for you the importance of those characteristics is a bit strange, right? They have no way of knowing how important those different characteristics are to you. So the validity may not be that high if those characteristics are not relevant to the people who want to use this information. So indeed, the reason why this particular set are quite difficult is because we're essentially talking about quality of life. And quality of life has a very strong personal element. Indeed, you could argue that that's why some people choose to live in Singapore and some people choose to live in Hong Kong. That may, even if everybody had a free choice between the two, many people may not choose to move because maybe they like the place where they're living. So maybe they like freedom of speech in Hong Kong, maybe they like the housing in Singapore, right? Or maybe they like the food in one place or the other, depending on whether they like spicy food or not. So clearly, how you rate the quality of life in a place will depend very much on which characteristics are important to you. Now, we've just talked about a few issues of operational design and choice. There are many other things if you're dealing with questionnaires. So specifically for questionnaires, there are a whole series of issues such as, are the questions clear? Are the respondents competent to answer those questions? So it's ridiculous to ask people a question such as, which is the most serious cancer in Hong Kong in terms of the most people who get this cancer? Because why should I care? In other words, I should care perhaps about cancers that are relevant to me or my family members, but why should I be an expert in the prevalence rates of cancers in Hong Kong? This is a ridiculous question to ask the general public. They shouldn't, in general, be competent to answer that. Questions clearly should be relevant. The questions need to be short enough that people haven't forgotten the beginning by the time you get to the end. Negative questions can be very difficult because particularly whether people have understood the negative element of it. Bias is a really sensitive issue. You have to be very careful about the wording. Positive and negative words can bias the question. In fact, questionnaire design is arguably an art as much as a science. And one crucial issue is the need to do a pilot or a pre-test to check that your questionnaire works as designed. In other words, nobody should use a measuring instrument without first checking that it works well. So that might involve some qualitative analysis. It might involve checking the reliability and validity of that questionnaire. Even if there's a pre-existing questionnaire but in a different language, we may need to check that it still works well after translation. There might be language problems or there might be cultural issues which might mean that the questionnaire doesn't work as well in one place as it does in another. So questionnaire design is worthy of a course in itself, and my faculty, the Faculty of Social Science, runs a course every summer on questionnaire design. Now you may think, I work in a laboratory, most of these things are not relevant to me, but actually they are. So reliability and validity are important for all measuring instruments, not just for questionnaires. So if you're thinking about how to measure something in a laboratory, you still need to know the reliability and validity, but there may be some other important elements to think about. So stability. So stability meaning, do I have to keep calibrating my equipment? Clearly, if you don't calibrate it, then the validity is damaged. Ease of calibration can be important if you have to calibrate it frequently. Portability might be very important if you need to take it out into the field. Of course, robustness would also be important there. Maybe it doesn't work very well if there's a temperature change, let alone cost. So there's both the cost of buying the equipment and the cost of keeping the equipment in good shape. So there are many different things to be thought about when choosing a measuring instrument. If you're working in a laboratory, you may not get those choices as a junior researcher. All the equipment may have been chosen by your supervisor or someone else who controls the lab. But in the long run, when you're running a laboratory yourself, you will need to think about all of these things. And from a research perspective, as I said, reliability and validity are very important. Now, the next section I'm going to talk about is about some other operational choice considerations. If you're not going to use a questionnaire, some of these may not be relevant, and you can skip over the next section in the video if you're not interested. So if using a questionnaire, there's what we call a unipolar scale and a bipolar scale. So what does this mean? So unipolar means that it's a one-directional scale. So that might be how much do you support something? So that goes from 0 up to full support. Or if it's an agreement scale, that's a bipolar scale because it goes from strongly disagree all the way up to strongly agree. Okay, that's not too complicated. For a bipolar scale, though, there is one additional element you need to think about. What about the middle of the scale? So do you have an item for the midpoint of a bipolar scale? So for example, if it goes from strongly agree to strongly disagree, is there a midpoint? So some people refuse to put a midpoint on the scale because they want to force the respondents to choose either agree or disagree. But that can sometimes mean people will refuse to answer. So for example, if you ask a sensitive question like, do you agree that the government was justified in postponing the election? Some people may say that they honestly partly agree and partly disagree, and so they don't want to take a position of either choosing an agree or a disagree. So if you put something like indifferent or neutral, are those really the midpoint on the scale? So ironically, in Chinese, this is often a bit easier because you often would put neither agree nor disagree. And some people may feel that that's an appropriate way to label my response on that scale. So is there a difference between unipolar and bipolar? Well, one of the issues is that it's very hard to compare the two. So if I've asked a questionnaire item which goes from I strongly support the government down to I don't support the government at all, and somebody asks the question on a strongly disagree to agree scale in terms of tell me to what extent you agree with the statement I support the government. Right, so it's quite hard to work out how to map the items on the bipolar scale to the items on the unipolar scale. So that can make it hard to compare across response scales. So this may mean if you want to compare your results to other people, then you may need to look at what scale they have chosen. So it may not be entirely a matter for you to just choose what you think is most appropriate. Detail. So detail is a bit like precision, but it's the detail of the categories that we choose. So it's not the units, but it's the detail of the categories. So for example, marital status. So the simplest version of marital status would simply be single or married, right? You're either single or you're married. Those are the two options. But you could have always single, currently married, and others. So then others would include people who were previously married but are no longer married. But that could be people who are divorced, or it could be people who are widowed. So this reminds me of a very interesting study of mental health for men and women, which showed that sometimes the level of detail is important. So when they did this study, they looked at what happened to the mental health of men and women when their marital status changed. So when they looked at men, when men were widowed, their mental health generally got worse. And they looked at women when they were widowed, their mental health generally got worse. But when they looked at divorce, for mental health of men, their mental health generally got worse after divorce. But the mental health of women generally improved after divorce. So you can see that in some situations, the distinction between divorce and widowhood may be very important. Okay, dimensions. So a concept may have many dimensions. So one of the questions is which ones are of interest. So this came up really in the context of validity just now. I talked about content validity. So if I'm trying to measure corruption, there's so many different dimensions of corruption which I might be interested in, and I need to be clear which ones am I trying to measure. So it could be how much corruption there is, what causes the corruption, what should be done about it, what is your personal response to corruption, and so on. But that's not the only aspect where there may be multiple dimensions. Even in things which are apparently quite objective, it turns out sometimes there are still many different dimensions. So one example is outcomes from medical treatment. So in some ways, the most fundamental outcome from medical treatment is life or death, right? So if you're talking about people who are dealing with a very serious disease, that may be your primary outcome. Are people alive or dead at the end of your study? But of course, there are many other situations where there are quite bad outcomes which are not death. So if you think about the virus, right? Although we think about the virus as very serious, there's been about 100 deaths so far. So that sounds very serious, but if you compare that to the number of deaths from the flu every year, it's not actually that serious. Right? It's just serious in the sense that these are additional deaths that we wouldn't have expected to have occurred normally. So one of the problems about life and death is also then you have to say after what follow-up period. So actually, even if life and death are the primary outcome, usually we would look at survival time after treatment. Because after all, ultimately everybody dies. So when some people say, this disease led to so many deaths, we have to be very careful. So many of those 100 COVID deaths, it's quite arguable whether they were really deaths due to COVID, right? Would those people have died even if they hadn't got COVID? Quite a lot of them may have died anyway because these were people who were often already quite sick. So that's why sometimes this is not the way we assess the impact of disease such as COVID. So anyway, survival time after treatment is at least a more sensitive assessment than life and death, particularly because we can also take into account age that people were at the beginning. So as we said, if people are already quite old or sick, then maybe their survival time is not that great anyway. Right? So we can compare across treatments. How else might we assess the outcome? Well, we could look at pain. In fact, pain is something that's quite hard to measure. Right? How do you assess pain? There is no clear objective scale for pain. So some researchers have argued that we need a reference point for pain, but the problem is that our reference points are not all the same. So my wife told me that when she gave birth, that was the most painful experience she'd ever had, even though she'd had injections to try and reduce the pain. So as a man, I hope never to experience that, of course. So what's my reference point? What's the most painful thing that's ever happened to me? Probably nothing on that scale. So if I'm asked to assess pain, I don't really know how to compare my pain to a woman's pain who's given birth. So pain is actually quite difficult to decide. So within individuals, it may not be so bad. I can say this experience was more painful than that. But if you're comparing across individuals, it can be quite difficult to have a reliable and valid measurement. blood pressure. So blood pressure, we normally have two blood pressure measurements. One which is basically when the blood pressure is going up, and the other one's when it's going down. But actually, blood pressure is not that easy. The quality of these electronic meters is not that great. But that's not too hard to measure. Something like white cell counts. So traditionally, white cell counts were measured manually by drawing a sample on a slide and counting. These days, it's becoming increasingly mechanized to do the white cell counts. So that's not too hard. But of course, that may not be that relevant unless the disease and the treatment affect the white cell counts. And then lastly, quality of life. So quality of life is really quite hard. Again, because exactly as we were just saying about the Hong Kong-Singapore comparison, this is very personalized. So for example, let's say that you have cancer of the tongue, for example, and the doctor comes to you and tells you that you have a choice. If you want to live a long life, you may need to have your tongue removed, or at least part of your tongue removed. If you don't agree to have your tongue removed, your life expectancy may be halved, for example. Now that, of course, will depend to some extent on how important is tasting to you. So I must confess that for me, that wouldn't be a difficult choice. I would always choose life over being able to taste things. But there are some people for whom food and drink are the most important things in their lives. So for those people, they might be very unhappy to give up that. So they might actually make a different choice, right? So we can't always assume that everyone else's priorities are the same as ours. Okay, levels and scales of measurement. So we're going to start out with very basic levels and scales of measurements. We're going to assume that there's one and only one response. So that's what we call mutually exclusive and exhaustive. Mutually exclusive means no overlap between our responses. I can only choose one response. Exhaustive means there is always a response which I can choose. Okay? So we're going to assume for simplicity that we have this mutually exclusive and exhaustive. There are situations where you may want a scale to allow multiple responses, but we're going to leave that aside for the moment. So let's take an example, employment status. So normally for employment status, the government records people into three categories: underemployed, unemployed, and employed. And if you're economically active, you must fit into one of those three, and they have very specific definitions. So economically active means I either have a job or I'm trying to find a job. Okay? So what does that mean? Unemployed means I don't have a job. Underemployed means I have a job, but I'm not doing enough hours. So particularly during the virus, there are quite a lot of people who are underemployed. For example, even now, most of the restaurants are not back to normal, so quite a few people only get limited hours, perhaps. Employed essentially means you have a full-time job, and that's what you want. So in this case, the definitions are drawn up in a way that you can fit into one and only one category. Okay, so we have this hierarchy of our scales. We start with the bottom of our hierarchy with a nominal scale. So nominal scale means there is no ordering of the attributes. So for example, gender. So traditionally we'd only have male and female. These days you might also have people who are, I think the correct phrase is non-binary, people who don't want to label themselves as either male or female. We could have religion. Generally religion is considered to be mutually exclusive, maybe not exhaustive unless we have the category of no religion, but usually people only have one religion and there's no ordering. Race, So race is actually a really tricky point. So until Donald Trump got elected, the most sensitive question on the US Census was race or ethnicity. And the reason why was because many people wanted to write in what their race was. They did not accept the categories that were given to them. So, for example, people wanted to essentially say who all their grandparents were. So, I have one grandparent who is Native American, one grandparent who's from Scandinavia, one who's from a Caribbean country, and one's from Africa. Then I want to be able to say that that's what my race is. So many people were not happy with the categories that they were given. But clearly, at least we would hope there should be no ordering of those categories. Okay, so the next level up in our hierarchy is ordinal scale. Ordinal scale means that the attributes can be ranked, although sometimes the ranking can be arguable. So for example, education, it can sometimes be a little bit arguable how we compare education across systems. So for example, recently when these medical experts came to Hong Kong from the mainland, one of the sensitive issues is that Hong Kong doesn't generally recognize mainland doctor qualifications. In fact, Hong Kong doesn't actually recognize generally doctor qualifications from almost anywhere in the world. So it's not particularly a mainland issue, but that's an example of where it can get tricky. Interval scale means that differences between attributes have a consistent meaning. So an example of this would be temperature, where we not only can talk about the temperature is 30 degrees centigrade, but we can say today is 3 degrees centigrade hotter than yesterday. Right? We can talk about that difference in a consistent manner that has a consistent meaning. Or it could be something like net profit, where again, net profit has a consistent meaning. And then lastly, we're going to talk about ratio scale. Ratio scale means that we not only have an interval scale, but also we have a meaningful zero reference point so that ratios and percentages have a consistent meaning. So, for example, income, we can either say this person earns $10,000 more than that one, or we can say his income is 20% more than that person. So we can talk about in percentage terms or in absolute difference terms. Similarly for height or weight or age or area of a flat, or even for measurements which are integers, such as number of hospital visits. We could say that elderly people in general have twice as many hospital visits as younger people, and that's a meaningful statement. We don't necessarily have to talk about the difference in the number of visits. We can talk about the ratios. So these level of measurements are ordered. The higher we are in that ordering, the wider the range of statistical tools that are usable. So if you want to do statistical analysis or models, you need to make sure that your measurement tools are high enough up on that ordering that you're going to be able to fit the sorts of models you want to try and understand what's going on. So we also have both index and scale measures. So these are both ordinal measures. So scale measures are ones which have an ordered response level, such as the strongly disagree to strongly agree that I talked about. Index is where we count the number of positive or negative responses. So for example, if we're creating an index, we obviously want the underlying items to be measuring the same thing. Usually we weight the items equally, but we may weight them differently. We often do what we call item analysis, which is a form of reliability check to check that each item is consistent with all the other rest of the items, that they're measuring the same thing. And we may also try to do an external validation of the complete scale. As I mentioned, we have to be careful because the scales, when you translate them, they may not always work in quite the same way. One of the things you need to be careful about with the Likert scale is the fact that it's ordinal does not mean that you can use it as an interval scale. So people often would say, okay, I've got my 4-point Likert scale. I'm going to code them 1, 2, 3, 4, and I can treat it as if the values are 1, 2, 3, 4. But that's assuming that the difference between a 1 and a 2 is the same as the difference between a 3 and a 4. But that may not be the same, right? In particular, the difference between disagree and agree may be very different to the difference between agree and strongly agree. So we should not assume that a Likert scale is an interval scale without checking whether this is valid. So there are two other forms of scale that we can use. Semantic differential is where we give people two polar opposites and ask them to choose a point in between. So I could say, what's your feeling towards your family members, and give you a scale from love to hate. Right? And you could choose any point along that scale, or from simple to complex. Gutman's scaling is one other way of dealing with creating a scale. This way we look for items of increasing extremity and see if people respond consistently. And if that ordering is consistent, then we use this to create a scale. So for example, let's say we're interested in attitudes towards abortion. We could ask people, do you agree to abortion on demand? In other words, that every woman should have the right to choose if and when she wants to have an abortion. Okay? So many religious people would say no. Some people might say yes. We might then ask separately, do you agree that women should be able to choose to have an abortion after they've been raped? So logically, if you agree to abortion on demand, you should also agree to abortion after rape, right? But if you agree to abortion after rape, you may not also agree to abortion on demand. So that means we essentially now have a 3-point scale: those who never agree to abortion, those who only agree to abortion after rape, and those who agree to abortion after rape and on demand, right? So logically, that's what we should get. So if we had somebody who say they agree to abortion on demand but not after rape, that probably means that person is not reading the questionnaire carefully. Okay, so that brings us to the end of chapter 5.